Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of the Guide to Ship Handling. Today we will be covering pivot points. Pivot points is a very important concept in ship handling, as it is the point of which the ship rotates around. You can see in this diagram here that I've drawn up, this is what the projected motion of the ship would look like if the pivot point was about 2/3 of the length along the ship. This is a very standard position for the pivot point to be in during times of which the ship is moving ahead. One thing I would like to point out is when you are turning a ship, when you're going ahead, you need to be mindful of the amount of space you have. You can see here the stern of the ship moves out to port quite a lot when you're turning to starboard, and vice versa if you're turning to port. And this whole angle here is called the sweep area. We also see this sweep area when a ship is trying to sail against a current or in the wind, and the ship is almost crabbing. It's moving sideways, and it takes up a large sort of area. The pivot point is constantly moving. As you can see with these diagrams, when a ship is stationary, often the pivot point will be in the center. And so that means that the bow, when that is moving to port or to starboard, the stern is moving at roughly the same amount. When moving ahead, the pivot point is forward of the ship, like in the first slide I showed you, and that means that the bow will move much less than what the stern is moving, because it is rotating along this position here. And the opposite also happens when the vessel is moving astern. The bow moves a lot when you're turning, but the stern does not move quite as much. So you can see that you have these different positions, and that affects on how the ship actually moves through the water. One other point I would also like to make is the position of the pivot point also dictates what action you might want to consider when you're trying to maneuver the ship in a certain way. For example, if you're moving ahead, the best tool you have to turn the ship is the rudder, and that is because the rudder has got much more leverage over that pivot point than what, say, the bow thruster might have. So if you're doing 3 or 4 knots through the water ahead and you're trying to use the bow thruster to turn, you're not going to be having much leverage, and you will not see much effect when that is happening. Whereas if you use a rudder, when you're doing 3 or 4 knots, you'll have a much better chance at being able to turn that vessel. And the opposite is also true. If you're moving astern, the rudder will not have much effect. As we see in the last slide, the pivot point when you're moving astern is much further aft, and so you have a much smaller leverage or distance between the pivot point and the rudder. And so that means that if you're doing, say, 2 knots astern or 3 knots astern, and you're trying to turn the ship, the rudder is going to be not very effective at all. However, the bow thruster is all the way at the other end of the ship, very far away from where the pivot point is. And so this is why we see a lot of vessels use the bow thruster to steer when they are moving astern, because there is much more leverage, much more distance from the bow thruster to the pivot point. Similarly, if we're using tugs, say on a large cargo vessel, you need to remember that the pivot point plays a big role in determining how effective these tugs are acting. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen here, the ship is moving ahead, and the pivot point is about 1/3 of the way down the ship from the bow. So, similarly with the last slide, you can imagine that the tug on the stern of the vessel has a lot more leverage over that pivot point than what the bow or the forward tug has. And so when these two tugs here are pulling with the same force, the ship will turn to port, since the aft tug has greater leverage. As we can see here, the distance between these two tugs and the pivot point, there is a huge difference, and if they are both pulling at the same amount, there will be different outcomes. The ship will turn to port in this case. However, if we have the forward tug acting with a lot more force than what the aft tug is using, we can expect the ship to move almost sideways whilst moving ahead as well. This is all because these tugs are working in a moment. A moment is a ton meter, so that is the amount of tons of force being exerted times by the distance in meters over the pivot point. So looking back to example on the left here, they're both pulling at the exact same amount of force. However, the aft tug has got a greater distance, and so it has a greater moment, causing the turning effect. However, here, although the aft tug has a greater distance, it's using less power than the forward tug. The forward tug is less distance, but more power. And so it's a balancing game. If you can balance this right, you can have the ship move sideways. And I've seen often in real life ships moving sideways simply using the forward tug using approximately 3 times as much power as the aft tug. And when we're actually looking at the tugs themselves, we have different types of tugboats. There's multiple different types. In this example here, we're looking at ASD tugs, which is they're essentially tugs with pods at the stern of the vessel. And we're also looking at voyage Schneider tugs, where they have a propulsion system located near the bow of the tug. You can see here the tugs are pointing in different directions. And this is because with tugs, the pivot point moves extremely close to where the tow line is connected. And so if you have these vessels flipped the other way around, and say the ASD tug has a tow line connected near the stern, you can see that there won't be much leverage between the pivot point and the engines. And so this would make it very difficult to control the tugs. And same with the voyage Schneider tug. If its bow was pointing towards the ship and the tow line was connected to the bow, there would be very little leverage to turn. And so, again, very little steerage for these tugboats. And so that's why different tugs may be facing in different orientations. I'm sure many of you maritime enthusiasts have seen, or simulator players have seen, the conning display, where you have an outline of a ship and you get two values. You have the movement of the bow and the movement of the stern. And you often see this when you're trying to rotate the ship or turn the ship. You can see in this example here, I've said that the bow is moving at 0.8 knots to starboard and the stern is moving at 1.4 knots. And I've put a vector on. So obviously the arrow at the stern of the vessel is worth a greater amount than the bow. And you can almost draw a line between these two to identify where the pivot point is. And so being able to do this in your head while you're actually maneuvering is very important, because you can get a good idea of the position of which the ship is rotating around. Obviously, you're not going to be drawing up a diagram like this on the spot, but if you can look at the numbers you are given on your conning display, you can obviously see that the pivot point is going to be closer to the bow in this example, because the bow isn't moving as much as the stern. Okay guys, so I've just jumped into NAUTIS Home here, and we're going to be playing around with a few different exercises and examples of how the pivot point changes the movement of the ship. So I've just increased my speed here, moving astern 2.5 knots. And what I'm going to be doing is using one of the pods to try and turn the ship. You can see here, it's very slow to rotate. It's not very reactive at all. We are starting to get a little bit of movement though, and you can expect to see some movement, but not much at all. We're already doing 3 knots astern now. So what I'm going to be doing is using the bow thruster now, and we'll compare how effective that is as opposed to using the engines. And just looking at the conning display right now, you can note that the bow is moving almost 1 knot to port, whilst the stern is only moving 0.3 of a knot to starboard. And again, that is because we have the pivot point located near the stern right now, so we can expect to see less movement from the stern. And using the bow thruster now, which by the way is much less powerful than the pods, we can already see that we're already getting a good rotational speed. And just to also note, we are doing 4 knots astern, which is almost out of the range for bow thrusters. If you go sort of above 4 or 5 knots, the effectiveness of the bow thruster is heavily reduced. Okay everyone, so I have the ship right now moving at about 6 knots ahead, and I'm just going to do a series of turns and take note of the conning display, the values of how far or how fast the bow and the stern moves in the opposing directions. So as we've already discussed, we're moving ahead, so the pivot point will be quite far forward. And we can already see the stern is moving 1.3 knots to starboard, and the bow is only moving half a knot to port. So again, by vectoring those two numbers in our head, we can already imagine that the pivot point is quite far forward. Okay, so I have the ship steadied on 080, and I'm going to demonstrate the ineffectiveness of the bow thruster whilst the vessel is moving ahead. Again, this is because the bow thruster is located close to where the pivot point is, and so we're not going to see much effect from it. So I've got the bow thruster set 70% to port, and we're still doing 5.5 knots ahead. As you can see, very, very ineffective right now. Now I'm going to stop the bow thruster, and I'm going to start to slow the ship down. And you'll notice as the ship slows, the effectiveness of the thruster will start to increase dramatically. This time I'll thrust to starboard. Take note of the rate of turn indicator. That's a very good measurement for the effectiveness. And you can also look at the conning display as well. We're already down to 2 knots, and you can see the ship is starting to rotate quite quickly. I'll stop both engines there. You can see how quickly the ship is starting to move now, as compared to when we were moving ahead. Okay, so I have the ship stopped dead in the water right now, and my goal is to simply just rotate on the spot, and I'm going to try and maintain the pivot point to be in the middle of the ship, and I can achieve this by balancing out the engines and the thrusters whilst also monitoring the conning display. For the pivot point to be in the middle, I need both the bow and stern movement indicators to be equal. So I'm going to go ahead and start to rotate the ship now. So I can see that they're both quite equal right now. Stern's moving just a tad quicker than the bow, but it is very close. There we are, 1.6 knots for both of them. And getting the aerial view right now, it's hard to see, but we are rotating on the spot. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to demonstrate is that it is possible for the pivot point to actually be in a position that's not on the ship. In this instance, I'm going to be doing an exercise where the pivot point is going to be where this buoy is, the safe Cardinal marker. Sorry, the safe water buoy. And the way I'm going to be doing this is we have to rotate around this buoy, but always be pointing at the buoy. And the way to approach this sort of task is you always want to be having more power from the stern than the bow, but you're pushing in the same direction as well. So I'm going to go ahead, we're going to be rotating anti-clockwise around this buoy. So I'll be using the starboard pod for that. Sorry, port pod for that. The reason why I use the port pod is the flow of water will be coming straight out the side of the ship. The port pod is this one here. We're rotating with the stern moving to starboard. So if we use the port pod, the wash from that pod will be going straight out. If we were to use the starboard pod, that wash would be blowing straight into the port pod, and it can actually cause damage in real life doing that sort of thing. So generally speaking, anything over 60 degrees of angle on the pod, you want to be using the outboard pod for that. So I'm going to go ahead here and I had that the wrong way, and begin to rotate. And I'm trying to maintain the same distance as well. So right now she's probably only about 70 meters off our bow, and I'm going to try and maintain that position while rotating around that buoy. And you want to be watching this. You want both the arrows to be pointing to starboard, but you want the stern vector to be more. So I need more power from the bow. So this is a good exercise because it's about taking control of where the pivot point is. As we discussed earlier, the pivot point is also determined by the movement of the ship, whether you're going ahead or astern, but you can also manage the pivot point using your own power. You can see visually too, you want that Cardinal marker, that safe water buoy to be in the same position with reference to your ship. I can see here we're starting to come astern slowly, so I'm going to just adjust that port pod. I'm going to thrust starboard 60%. We're trying to rotate the ship around the buoy. So the pivot point, once again, is where this buoy is, because that's the position of which we are rotating around. So I can see visually that safe water buoy is in a very stable position right now. It's not moving. Again, if you increase power from one, either the pod or the bow thruster, you're going to have to do it for the other one. So you can imagine how doing a exercise like this would come in handy, because there are some ports you might come to where you have to do maneuvers like this, where you have to rotate around a certain position, not necessarily on the spot. I know there's plenty of ports in this game where you have to rotate and keep the bow in the same position. And that's where exercises like this come in handy, because you're practicing keeping one point of reference or one pivot point. So if you want to keep the bow as the pivot point, you will have the ability to do that after doing exercises like this. Okay everybody, so I've just about rotated around this 180 degrees, and as you can see, not much has changed. Once you get into a bit of a rhythm, you find the control settings that seem to work for the maneuver you're trying to carry out. It's easier from that moment onwards. It's finding that initially what you need to do. That's the hard part. And that's it for today's episode. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you learnt something from that. And I definitely recommend you all to try out different exercises, different maneuvers, and experiment. So, yep, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.